Hello and welcome to the latest edition of BM Talks with me, Helen Thomas, the CEO and founder of Blonde Money, independent macro research consultancy. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Silvana Tenreyro. I will give you a very brief introduction. I'm sure you do not need one, but she did, of course, serve on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee from 2017 to 2023 and is a professor of economics at the London School of Economics. So, welcome, Silvana.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you so much for your time. So many things that I want us to cover, but let me start with that time you spent at the MPC. Because what a period to be involved in a central bank. You had a seat at the table for a period of significant shocks from the aftermath of the Brexit decision through the pandemic and, of course, the war in Ukraine and the concomitant increase in inflation we saw after that. Now, in hindsight, and there's been many, many thoughts on this, but what do you think is the biggest lesson for policymakers from this period?
Indeed, those were very busy times. It was a time in which all tail risks materialized. The energy crisis that we had was much bigger than what happened during the oil crisis in the 1970s. And as you mentioned, the pandemic, the aftermath of the referendum. We had six chancellors in that
Ooh,
period,
wow.
four prime ministers, the mini budget, the LDI crisis, and so on. So it was really busy. And I think what you learn is that the biggest setbacks to growth came from shocks for which the country was not prepared.
Mm,
And in particular, we didn't have an energy strategy to cope with the large increase in energy prices. We didn't have a protocol to cope with a public health shock like the pandemic.
mm,
And so as a country, we do need a macro strategy to deal with risk. And
mm,
that strategy requires at least three pillars. First, more investment in technological diversification, particularly in technologies and inputs that are critical and have low substitutability. This includes energy, potentially water, and other critical inputs. And when it comes to energy, we need to think about different sources of energy, not just gas, but also hydropower, wind, solar, and so on. If you
mm,
think about the countries that coped well with the energy crisis, like Switzerland, they were ready to switch from gas to hydropower and solar and
mm,
wind. We didn't have that preparedness. The second pillar is more integration with partners that have low geopolitical risk. And this
mm,
integration can lead to diversification of risks and help us reduce exposure to specific trading partners, input suppliers, or buyers. Reshoring is not a strategy to build resilience. It makes us more vulnerable and exposed to domestic shocks like weather events, which might become more virulent as climate continues to change.
mm.
And finally, we need to build buffers to be ready to deal with these shocks and think about what buffers we need in terms of energy, again, water, food, and so on. So preparedness for shocks, because the setbacks to growth can be very, very damaging and can have long-lasting consequences.
Now, you didn't mention nuclear when you were listing power options. I mean, maybe that was you were listing many. Does that mean, I guess you're talking about the UK specific situation. Obviously, it takes a very long time to build that kind of capacity. Is that maybe why were you not mentioning, or you think nuclear could be part of it, or?
Nuclear definitely can be part of the portfolio within energy. And in fact, again, countries like France have coped much better than the UK because they had the nuclear capacity.
Mm,
So this definitely has to be part of the equation, and it obviously requires an assessment of the risks, and there are many decisions to be taken about around that, and that has to be part of
mm.
this risk exercise and really thinking about stress testing the economy. Where are the weak links that might lead to big
Mm.
growth setbacks? And that's where the thinking has to be put.
Just very quickly, as we're talking about shocks, and I'm thinking there. other shocks that we could hit us. I mean, the government has asked for preparedness for people on like having batteries at home and water, and if there was an electricity outage or something. But I was just wondering, while I have you, when the pandemic hit and everything became virtual, as a policymaker in the MPC, uh, how did it feel? How was it for you to be communicating in a different way? Were you quite impressed? It happened quickly, like you were able to get together and make your decisions, or I would love a flavor of how it actually felt on the ground to try and transition as everybody did. But it's just interesting to hear it from somebody who was in a central bank at the time.
It was interesting because the transition was slightly slower than in other places. At the beginning, we had a very dated technology. We were communicating in Equinox. I don't know if you ever came across, but it was really not, frontier technology. So it took a while until we moved into Teams when it was
Mm.
secured enough so that we could have the meetings there. Um, but observing it from outside, I mean, it was pretty impressive how the whole world switched to a new technology very quickly,
Yeah.
and so that part was successful. Um,
Mm.
and I think there were bits for which we definitely we were prepared. The bank had been preparing the system for
Mm.
uh, financial crisis,
Yeah.
and that didn't escalate during the pandemic. There was a dash for cash in March 2020, but it didn't have long repercussions. The bank acted timely to prevent, and not just the Bank of England, but all central
Mm.
banks were very well equipped to deal with it.
Yeah.
Um,
Sometimes I have to remind ourselves of where we were, even just what, like 5 years ago. Actually, it's relatively recent history,
Absolutely.
but we
Yeah.
forget. If I can turn to your last speech that you gave as an MPC member, you spoke of how for central bankers, credibility is sacrosanct. With political attacks increasing on central banks globally, do you think their credibility is at risk? And if so, how should they respond?
Yeah, credibility is fundamental and it rests on that independence of central banks, which is critically important. Um, and to be clear, I think in this juncture, the Fed's independence is being challenged.
Mm.
However, I see the ECB, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England in a much stronger position. I think the governments in Europe do understand the importance of central bank independence, and that's not being challenged at the moment. But I do see challenges. I mean, they are obvious across Atlantic. The
Mm.
best a central bank can do is to stay mission focused, focus on the mandate that they were given and not succumb to political pressures because that's a recipe for a disaster. So I think, yeah, what I would say, stay loyal to the mandate and uh,
Yeah,
don't
of
give
course.
up.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, the Bank of England has been through quite a period of a review of itself, of its processes, of the mandate, and sticking to it, because, of course, we've had the Bernanke review. Um, Now, do you have any thoughts on whether Dr. Bernanke's recommendations went far enough, or could there be any improvements on what has been discussed? Obviously, it's still working through implementing some of these recommendations. But yes, what do you make of this review?
I think there are two main points in the review that I could see. I mean, the first one actually was that the forecasting performance of the Bank of England was not different from other central banks. The same forecast errors, I mean, which had to do with the size of the shocks and the unpredictability of some of these shocks. I mean, you cannot predict a war in Ukraine or you cannot predict a pandemic as a central banker. So those were comparable across central banks. But what the Bernanke review highlighted, and we were very aware of that, is a huge technological gap
Mm.
that was at the Bank of England. We were behind with the IT and data infrastructure, and that meant that there were delays in the analysis, or not all the analysis could be done at speed. And I think that's where the focus and the effort of the Bank of England should be put on. There were issues with staff turnover as well, which have to do with the fact that the Bank of England doesn't, pay necessarily competitive salaries, and so that was a challenge. But most visibly, it was an issue with the IT and data infrastructure. So, I mean, once you fix that, the rest, is very easy to solve, because, with the right infrastructure, you can produce the scenario analysis and other recommendations that he put there. I mean, of course, everything relies on the judgment of the MPC members, and so it's fundamental to keep that selection of MPC members robust and transparent, and that's a big part of the performance of a central bank at the end.
One thing I just interested in your thoughts on this was the fan charts. The fan charts having been a part of Bank of England, what was the inflation report became the monetary policy report quarterly, and there's been a move away from that and more looking at these scenarios. Do you have any thoughts on the usefulness of fan charts or not? I don't know if you have any strong opinions about this.
These play different roles. The fan charts give you an idea of the uncertainty around the central forecast. So that's the scenario, the central scenario that you're proposing, or the model scenario, and then you can see the uncertainty around that. The type of scenario analysis that Bernanke was suggesting was, okay, when we want to think about something else, for example, a pandemic, that's not going to be on your central scenario, and it's not going to be on, the fan chart. It's a completely different set of assumptions. And so that type of analysis you can do separately with, drawing scenarios like the ones we did, for example, during Brexit, looking at different Brexit possibilities, if there was no deal, if there was, an average deal, and so on. So the bank had done, a lot of scenario analysis. I think the point was that it became more costly, and, in a time of so much uncertainty, you would like to do a lot more scenario analysis, and that was not feasible at the time, given these gaps, technological gaps that I just mentioned. But so this serve different roles, and I think it's true that not everybody understands the fan charts, but they play a role, and perhaps the financial sector can interpret those fan charts more easily than perhaps the public. But these are different roles. I mean, I think the risk with if you just give scenarios is that, okay, there are many challenges there. How do you select a scenario? And that again is depends on the judgment of the MPC members, and there's no really a clear method, even though people are trying to come up with some. In academia, at least, people are making an effort to come up with a protocol. How would you select? But in the end, it's there's a lot of discretion. For example, now, how would you design? What would be the relevant scenarios? Should we look at cyber attacks? Should we look at? There's an infinite set, and so it's you have to be careful with the selection, because you don't want to introduce more fear or uncertainty than already is. And so when you use the scenarios, when you really want to communicate something that cannot be well communicated in words, or requires more analysis. So I see scenarios also can be helpful to explain the reaction function of the central bank. You change the conditioning assumptions. So say, the central forecast rests on some conditional assumptions on the path for energy prices. You change that, and you show how your reaction function will change in response, and how the whole forecast will change. So you can use it to communicate important messages, but my sense is that in general you want to use them sparingly, because you don't want to inject more uncertainty than already there is in the economy. And
Well, yes. Let me ask you about central bank communication then, because yes, of course, selecting a scenario doesn't suddenly mean it becomes the high probability scenario. In fact, you may don't want to necessarily put a actual probability on it. As you say, I think this concept of a reaction function is very useful. Particularly now we're in maybe a different regime from the prior, let's say, 15 years, where we had been in a very disinflationary, zero lower bound situation, and now we're in a more high inflation, high geopolitics type scenario, which is, I think, often for market participants, they sometimes they're learning about this shift, but I think they're still learning about the way policy works. And yes, I want to ask you about this communication, because markets, of course, they try to second guess the central bank. This is the key goal here is, of course, the price of money. The interest rate drives the valuations of so many different assets. I mean, how useful or harmful do you think forward guidance has been in managing expectations?
yeah, so of course, markets are doing their job. That's what they have to do. Uh, I'm all for forward guidance, the type, the Delphic forward guidance, which is about communicating the reaction function of the central bank.
Yeah.
It's a way to explain how the central bank conducts monetary policy. And so I see forward guidance as that, as telling the public, telling markets what the central bank plans to do given this forecast. And then it can also show what it would do in alternative scenarios, so spelling out the reaction function. And that's how I view the ideal form of forward guidance. What I think has been harmful at times is the type of Odyssean forward guidance, that is unconditional, no contingent clauses attached, and that can be harmful because you are tied up, and it's not it's not the right policy anymore, and so all this type of forward guidance that is contingent. I mean, it's not time contingent, but time dependent. So we will hold rates until September X. But that's really not the type of helpful forward guidance. So there are different types there. We have a paper with Mowatsi on that, which we presented at the board, explaining the different types of forward guidance and trying to assess the effectiveness of those different types. So, I mean, of course, there are always risks, even when you are very careful with your communication and stating the conditional clauses. It might be that those conditional clauses get lost in the reporting. And so that's why you need that guidance also to be very sharp. And ideally, the message needs to be clear and simple. And so you have to be careful about, complicated forward guidance.
Yeah.
That's certainly a challenge. But yeah, I think in this world of uncertainty, precisely, it's very, very important that central banks explain what they are doing, how they're conducting policy. And of course, they cannot foresee the shocks ahead, but at least give a sense of how they will react if they were to materialize, and aligning the expectations of markets with the central bank. I mean, that's precisely what we would like to do. So yeah, I'm positive on the right form of
Yeah.
forward guidance.
Because sometimes it's been maybe the case that markets almost expect a central bank to be kind of omnipotent and all-knowing, all-seeing, and can maybe over-interpret that. Of course, central bankers have judgment, they have models, they have forecasts, but they don't know everything. How could they possibly know? And it is it's surprising sometimes to me how much I think markets will always pour over a press conference or a speech, um, which is good, and they should look at that. But there is I worry sometimes a risk of expecting almost too much from the central bank. Do you know what I mean? Do they think
Yeah,
they?
yeah, yeah. So I think, yeah, and sometimes, I mean, there are misunderstandings. The forward guidance in the communications of central banks should be taken as part of the forecasts. I mean, they're
Right.
really forecasts about
Mm,
how they will act if the projections that they have actually materialize. But
yeah.
it has to be clear that as you change the central projections, that forward guidance will also change the path, because forward
Yes.
guidance is basically about the path of interest rates
Mm,
conditional on your forecast. Once you change that forecast, that path also should
change.
change. And
Exactly.
in countries, some countries have managed to make it work very well. Like the Riksbank is used to
Mm,
communicating the path, and there's an understanding that when the projections change, the main forecast, then also the path changes, and there's no misunderstanding there. And to
mm,
some extent, the Fed as well. I mean, the dot plots move all the time when the forecast is changed. So if I agree with you, Helen, that at times there were misunderstandings on, what central banks said or not said, and so there is room for improvement on how the central banks communicate, but also on the side of the recipients, and perhaps the
mm,
media could do more to help people understand what is said, and but
mm.
yeah, so it's communication is always a two-way process,
Yes.
and so
That's a good one.
uh,
That's very good. Communication is a two-way process. I like that. That's important and forgotten sometimes. Um, and actually, looking at monetary policy, because markets do get so focused on this, and it has of course been it is always important, but it was a very important driver of asset prices for a long time. But we are now in a world of huge amounts of debt that governments have collected over these periods of these shocks, and there's a lot more focus on fiscal policy. Um, so, do you think? I mean, is there maybe markets and market participants are spending a bit too much time focusing on monetary policy? In some respects, fiscal policy, it's a bit messier. I mean, we talk about how central banks communicate. I mean, when you have a government communicating, it's not the market that is the only recipient, of course, for politicians. So, I mean, how do you see the balance between monetary and fiscal policy evolving in the next decade? Will the fiscal policymakers be much more in focus, do you think?
I I hope so. I mean, clearly, monetary policy has only one tool, which is the interest rates. In the short run, the interest rate. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe the long end to the extent that you do QE, QT. Um, but this is, a very blatant tool to deal with the complex problems of a big economy like the UK.
Mm,
So fiscal policy is key. And yeah, I agree with you that it receives less focus in the media, in academia as well. I mean, we spend way too much time thinking about monetary policy and not enough on the fiscal framework, on fiscal policy in general. And I think we need to move to the shift to fiscal policy. In part because most of the shocks that we were discussing before, these are real shocks. They affect the macroeconomy. Fiscal monetary policy can only do one thing, which is return inflation to targets, balance demand against that supply potential. But fiscal is the one that has the power to affect that supply potential
mm,
through spending and taxes. It can affect innovation and eventually investment and productivity. And so
mm,
that's a fundamental role. And ideally, you have a framework uh, that with automatic stabilizers, and that's, you don't need to change all the time. We are not in a discretionary world. So you have those stabilizers that move with the cycle and are embedded in a sustainable path.
Mm.
So yeah, I definitely agree that the focus needs to rebalance towards fiscal policy. That's where the power is to, solve many of the problems, that the real problems we have. Again, monetary policy is just about inflation. It's a very narrow mandate. It's about, bringing down inflation to
Mm.
target,
Well,
if
yeah.
it's
I have to
and
say that if anyone hasn't read it, the OBR's annual fiscal risks and sustainability report is a really, really good place to look at actually many things we've been discussing. And it's you know, entities like the OBR, whether people like them or don't like them or whatever they want to say about them, they're doing a big job here in analyzing and trying to provide some framework for these fiscal risks. Um, I read a lot of the OBR's output, and I'm just grateful that they produce it. We can argue about whether it's right or wrong, but at least it's there, which is good, which is useful. Um,
Yeah, I agree. And maybe there is a case for, given more resources to the OBR so that it can, really
mm,
be at the frontier of the analysis, and be ready, also have the capacity to respond to all the challenges that sometimes people bring up.
yes, absolutely. Oh gosh, we should probably get someone from the OBR on the next podcast. I just think, although they're probably quite busy at the moment. Anyway,
Until the 26th of
yeah, till the
November.
26th of November, exactly.
But then, and
But
this is the
then,
problem, it's, as soon as you have one budget, you start thinking about the spring budget. And that's part of the
yes,
problem in this country. I mean, we have too many budgets, and that political uncertainty and policy
mm,
volatility is not helpful.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, yeah, moving to one per year, you think would be more than enough, more than sufficient for the UK?
I think that could help. I mean, in countries like Germany, you have one every 5 years. So, there is a
Yeah,
balance to to
yeah, yeah, yeah.
reach
Absolutely.
there. And but certainly two budgets a year seems a bit too much, and the anxiety that goes with it and the distraction is just excessive.
Yeah. Um, on interest rates, I mean, they've broadly been rising from historic lows, although coming back down again now. But there's often talk about the neutral rate. Do you believe the neutral rate of interest has fundamentally shifted? Maybe, I guess, since 2020, since COVID, or you can tell me where you would put the shift if you believe it has shifted, where, when, and how that happened.
Well, it's all about the supply of savings and investment demand here. On the savings side, I think the factors that were pushing down on the risk-free natural rate of interest before the pandemic, they are still there. It's the demographics. We have
Mm,
longer lives now, thanks to improvements in medicine. This means that we will have a longer phase of retirement, and we need to save more, and that will remain there. So the other thing is uncertainty. We live in an uncertain world that generates more precautionary saving that will keep pushing down on the risk-free rate. So on the saving side, I think nothing has changed. We're in the same trend. On the investment side, I think at the moment there is more investment driven in part by AI. The defense and infrastructure investment, have picked up. So that has pushed up a bit on the natural rate of interest.
mm,
But I don't think if I think longer term, that would be too different from where we are. I mean, if I think about the UK, neutral for me would be around 2.5% now.
mm,
So we're still on restrictive territory if you think about
mm,
that reference point. I don't think that natural rate in the UK would be too different from Europe, and in fact, it's more of a global concept.
mm,
So yeah, I mean, I think there has been some increase because of the drive in investment coming from AI and defense spending. But I mean, we're talking, less than a percentage point and not a fundamental shift. And then again, as we continue aging and fertility rates fall, I think that would keep contributing to the.
So you think UK and Europe neutral rate is quite similar in that, yeah, these challenges you're talking about, these opportunities, they're quite similar macroeconomically. There's not much difference there.
Yeah, I mean, I view these trends as common to all advanced economies.
Okay.
So yeah, so I mean, and obviously the US is moving in a different direction at the moment, and maybe in the US things are not as clear. I mean, there's more to think about there because they're closing the economy at the moment, and that adds a different trend.
Mm,
But for Europe and the UK, or continental Europe and the UK, I think they would be more aligned.
yeah. We're coming towards the end of our time, and which is a shame because I could keep talking to you about many, many things. I'm going to ask you a last couple of questions. I'm going to ask you this. I don't know if you want to answer, and it's fine if you don't. I can remove this question, but it's because I mean, look, you have links in with Argentina. Argentina is now right in the forefront of US policy, which is absolutely fascinating. Maybe the question should be: have you been surprised at the US help they're giving with the currency swap lines with Argentina? And do you have any thoughts on that? What it might mean? I guess broadly for maybe actually the US vis-a-vis other economies, if they're maybe going to do this sort of policy elsewhere. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, I think the political alliance is important in that. I don't see the US, putting money necessarily in all Latin American
Mm,
countries or all developing countries. I think there is a personal relationship between President Milei and President Trump, and
mm,
that has been important in this decision, as well as the view of the U.S. that they have some interest in investments and so on in Argentina. I think, to me, the important thing, as they pass this cliff edge that they set to themselves, the next elections, I think Argentina has to move to a flexible exchange rate regime. The idea of having these
mm,
bonds, even if somewhat flexible, I mean, creates too much pressure. I mean, and we've seen this story before. And
mm,
this is why the textbook recommendation has always been for countries like Argentina that are commodity exporters. They really need flexible exchange rate
mm.
regimes with
Yeah,
independent monetary policy, and fixing the rate is, or even having bonds that are rigid is a recipe for disaster. So yeah, I can't wait for Argentina to move to the next phase of freeing the exchange rate.
excellent. Well, I'll end with a very general question, which is, what is one book or paper that every policymaker should read?
I think one of my favorite is Guns, Germs and Steel by Diamond, because it's about causality, and it makes you really think hard about the proximate and ultimate causes of a phenomenon. So that's a very important one.
Oh,
But as a macroeconomist, I have to say I would wish all policymakers, read a textbook, a macroeconomic textbook, and Mankiw is a really nice
the
one.
classic. Yeah.
Um, I think it's because it really brings home the notion that there are important spillovers, from shocks and from policy decisions that need to be taken into account. And often in policymaker, we focus on the direct, immediate impact, but
Mm,
don't think more broadly about, the system and the broader implications of shocks or policies, and thinking in those, what we call general equilibrium terms is very important, and that's the message of many of the macro textbooks.
Great. Well, look, I hope everybody listening rushes out. If they haven't already read Mankiw's books, please do. Or maybe they could chat GPT, as everyone does these days. A summary. That would be a good start for some policymakers, I would
That
suspect.
definitely, yeah.
Okay, well, Silvana, thank you so much for your time. This has been excellent. Really enjoyed it. Everybody, anybody who has feedback, please always you can contact me at helen@blondemoney.co.uk, or I'm on social media and LinkedIn. We love to hear your thoughts. And thank you again, Silvana, for your time.
Thank you, Helen. Have a good evening. Bye bye.
Bye.